Early agriculture in the Western Hemisphere and Eastern Hemisphere. Crops grown in the Western Hemisphere included maize, potatoes, beans, tomatoes, peppers, peanuts, papayas, avocados, pineapples, cocoa, and tobacco. Irrigation in the Americas was mostly large-scale. They had drainage systems and terraced hillsides to control rainwater. The Olmecs in particular had raised fields. The Chavan had complex, multi-leveled platforms on which they grew their crops. The southwestern desert areas had canals. In the Eastern Hemisphere, crops were mostly wheat and citrus fruits. Their irrigation came from flooding of rivers, which they had controlled with canals, dams, and dikes. In the Indus River Valley, they also had monsoons. The change from pastoral nomadism to a settled lifestyle. Pastoral nomadism is where tribes of people follow large herds of animals for food. They had no technology besides sticks and stones, and their social structure was mostly equal. They began to change when domestication of animals and plants came about. For domesticated animals, they had to plant crops, which led to planting crops for food. This was easier than following herds of animals, and they began to settle down. There was now a surplus of food and better nutrition. This was called a settled lifestyle. Humans planted crops and domesticated animals for food. Because they were not moving around and constantly worried about food, there was specialization. Because of better nutrition, there was intelligence and strength, which led to better technology. However, their social structure became unequal. They now had possession of land and of materials. In this time we see culture arise. The River Valley Civilizations. The Indus River Valley, located in India. Politically, they had a caste system. Their urban cities were major parts of the empire. The first sanitation system was seen here. Economically, the Indus River Valley had large trade networks over land. Overseas, they had docks and boats, but these were not very important. Trade overseas wasn't as feasible as trade over land because they could only sail during monsoons, which came too infrequently. Their food production consisted of self-sustaining wheats. Socially, the Indus River Valley was very advanced. They had waste systems in all their cities. We see measurements of length, mass, and time here. Their culture included handmade pottery, gold jewelry, and sculpted figurines. The Mesopotamian River Valley in Iraq. Politically, they were not unified. They had many small city-states, little communication, and constant warfare. Economically, they relied on the inconsistent flooding of rivers. They grew barley, onions, grapes, turnips, and apples. They were the first to make beer and wine. Socially, they were called the Sumer, believed to be one of the first Bronze Age people to arise. The random flooding of their rivers led the people to believe in malevolent gods. They studied philosophy and had a base 60 numeral system, which we still see today. They had a 12-month calendar with 7-day weeks. They wrote down their language in books. The Sumer were one of the first to have irrigation systems, wheels, dams, aqueducts, and wooden plows. The Nile River Valley, located in Egypt. Politically, they were controlled by a pharaoh who was believed to be a god. Scribes assessed taxes and kept records. Economically, the annual flooding of rivers kept agriculture rich. Their staples were bread and beer. Grapes for wine, lettuce, melons, and other crops were also grown. Socially, they had a written language called hieroglyphics. They had irrigation, quarried stone for pyramids, and glass technology. They had advanced mathematics, which they based off the flooding of the Nile. They also had complicated surgeries and medicine. They had different forms of literature and the first known peace treaty. Because of the consistent flooding of rivers, they believed in benevolent gods, completely opposite of the Sumer people. The Yellow River Valley, located in China. Politically, they believed in a dynastic cycle and the mandate of heaven. Similar to the divine right of rule in European countries, the mandate of heaven gave divine approval to an emperor. However, the mandate of heaven was more based on the conduct of a ruler. If the emperor was kind and fair, the deity heaven approved of his reign. If not, the people had a right to remove the emperor from the throne. Economically, the people of the Yellow River Valley were dependent on agriculture. Because of the annual flooding of the river, they always had fertile soil in which to grow crops. Socially, the Yellow River Valley was isolated by mountains and by the Gobi Desert. They had the first language called pictograms. Pictograms are representations of words by images, much like hieroglyphics. They developed a calendar with 360 days that revolved around the moon. They could also predict eclipses and were the first to record history. Early civilizations in the Eastern Hemisphere versus the Western Hemisphere. In the Eastern Hemisphere, early civilizations were all connected by trade routes, the exception being China and Japan. All civilizations developed around river valleys. They didn't alter the environment much because they relied on the flooding of rivers for fertile soil. They were polytheistic and believed in both malevolent and benevolent gods. They had differing political, social, and economic structures. In the Western Hemisphere, all early civilizations were isolated. They never made contact with other tribes in the Western Hemisphere and did not have the technology to cross the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. They developed by coasts because of the lack of rivers. Also because of this, they altered the environment to control rainwater for crops. They were polytheistic and believed in malevolent gods. Most Western Hemisphere civilizations made sacrifices. Most of these civilizations also had monarchies. Differences between the Roman, Han, and Gupta empires. The Roman Empire. Politically, Rome had many different kinds of governments, including a republic, a dictatorship, and a monarchy. Their democracy was the foundation for our modern democratic republic. They had strict organization and centralized control. Their large road system led straight to Rome. Economically, they had trade on land and sea. They relied on imports from trade overseas because there was little they could grow. They had the first coinage system. Socially, they had an unbeatable army. Their architecture included aqueducts, roads, baths, walls, theaters, temples, arches, cities, and palaces. They had a strong government, no matter what it was. All their towns were planned similarly, with a system of streets, running water, and sewers. In the center of each town was a forum, where shops, temples, and government buildings were located. At first they were polytheistic, and then they were Christian. They spoke Latin. Han China. Politically, they had a monarchy with emperors. Economically, they had agriculture and metallurgy. They had liquor, salt, and iron. There was private manufacturing and government monopolies. Socially, they were technologically advanced. They had blast furnaces for metals, timber for their houses, drainage systems with ceramic water pipes for their cities. They had negative numbers and used water wheels. The Han also had a calendar and the wheelbarrow. They were Taoist and Confucianist. The Gupta Empire in India. Politically, they had a monarchy that controlled a strong military. This military had 4 divisions: infantry, a cavalry that used longbows, elephants, and chariotry. Economically, their empire was supported through trade. Socially, they believed in a round earth. They discovered gravity and had advanced astronomy. They had the first base 10 numeral system and advanced medicine and surgeries. Sailing on the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean Sea. On the Indian Ocean, boats were made of teak wood plastered together. They had lateen sails to cut through monsoon winds and used no oars. They developed a zigzag technique, which allowed Indian Ocean mariners to cut straight through wind instead of following it in a circular pattern. This technique saved loads of time. Their boats were called junks, which were large and carried a lot of cargo. Because mariners on the Indian Ocean could sail farther, they usually settled down in other places, causing a lot of diversity. On the Mediterranean Sea, boats were made of hard wood and nailed together. They had square ships to catch all the wind they could. Because there was little wind, long banks of oars were used to navigate the boat. There were no monsoon winds here. They had smaller ships that carried less cargo. Because mariners could not travel far, there was little diversity. In fact, on the Mediterranean Sea, you rarely left sight of the shore. The expansion and appeal of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity. Buddhism started in India. It spread by trade along the Silk Road and finally came to dominate in South and Southeast Asia. It appeals to the lower class because it promotes equality. Hinduism started in India as well. However, it had very little expansion and still remains mostly in India today. It appealed to the government because it encourages people to work harder to move up in the caste system. Christianity started in Rome. It spread by trade, conflict, and communication. It spreads very rapidly into Europe and most of the world. It appeals to the unfortunates because it promotes a better afterlife in heaven.